The date is 1899. It's midnight in London. The town is silent, save for the odd tavern and the drunk staggering home. As you walk through the foul-smelling streets, you see a single horse-drawn cart. The black horse and cart chills you to the soul as the smartly dressed carriage driver stares at you with his haunting, disapproving gaze. The contents within the glass-panelled carriage prompts you to take off your hat in respect. You suspect the person inside was of high class. The black ebony coffin with its lace trim and brass fittings would not have been cheap. The slow clop, clop of the hooves is soon joined by another and another. The rich, elaborate hearses were soon intermingled with simple carts, each carrying a coffin of their own. The silent 50-strong procession of the dead travelled along Westminster Bridge towards Waterloo and turned into the waiting station, with a train standing by. The engine was as black as night, and coughed and hissed as it waited for its load, like an impatient dragon awaiting its feast. One by one each coffin was unloaded into the carriages. The pallbearers, having done their duty, disappeared into the thick fog, as if the fog claimed them again. And with a final nod and snort of steam, the train set off, knowing that for its passengers they would never be returning. It sounds like something from a horror story, but in London since 1854, this was actually a daily occurrence. Thanks to the Industrial Revolution, London had become the largest sprawling metropolis in the world. Millions of people flocked to the city in their droves, desperate to shed their city and country life for a better future with a brighter prospect. But thanks to the various industries, the city became smog-filled and foul-smelling. Poverty ran rife throughout the city, and because of the lack of sewage and treatment works, the waste of the city would often end up in the water supply. Diseases such as cholera, typhoid fever, diphtheria and TB would pass from family to family, bringing death to anyone, and because doctors at the time were expensive, the city's mortality rate was at an all-time high. The cemeteries were facing a crisis. Cremation was not a legal avenue that the cemeteries could utilise yet, and many people didn't like the idea of burning their dead. So when the local cemeteries filled up, the government commissioned the Magnificent Seven, 7 huge cemeteries set on the outskirts of the city. For a time it worked. The pressure was taken away from the centre, but burying the dead in the Magnificent Seven was costly. Many couldn't afford the costs and were subject to be buried in mass graves or go unclaimed on their death. Those unfortunate souls that would go unclaimed would be donated to science to be cut up in theatres by doctors wanting to know how the body works. The vast majority of criminals that were hung and those who could not be identified ended up on these tables, all thanks to an 1832 law passed in Parliament giving doctors greater access to dead bodies and effectively stopping the body snatchers digging up the dead and selling them for a profit. For about 8 years, all was good, until the city was gripped with a wide-spreading cholera epidemic. The epidemic sent a wave of death throughout the country and obliterated entire families. The poor were hardest hit, and in the space of over a few months, 15,000 people in the city alone were dead. Cholera was so feared the institutions would not take unclaimed bodies, so the only option was to bury the dead in mass graves. The dead quickly filled the Magnificent Seven, so much so that bodies were laid on top of bodies with barely an inch of topsoil covering them. The residents nearby claimed that they were not able to live due to the stench of decay, and it wasn't uncommon to see bones in the grass. Seeing that the graveyards were literally overflowing, Sir Richard Braun hatched a plan. He proposed that a new mega cemetery be built. It would be 2,000 acres across, with large fencing to deter would-be thieves and give the dead needed privacy. The only problem was its location. Braun proposed that the cemetery lay far outside the city, near the village of Brockwood in Surrey. It was far away to neutralise any health threat from decay, but not too far for loved ones to visit their dearly departed, and the land was cheap. Instead of horse and hearse bringing their dead, the dead would be taken out of the city by a nearby line from Waterloo to Southampton. It was practical, able to accommodate several funerals and mourners at a time, and it was relatively affordable. The plan, though, was not popular. Railways were new-fangled things, and to some, they just didn't fit the decorum of a proper burial. And the thought that the rich and the upper-class coffins would share the same carriage with common folk was unimaginable. Even in death, class is class. Despite the objections, the government took the proposal seriously, and in June 1851 they agreed a new act to create the London Necropolis and National Mausoleum Company, partnering up with the London and South Western Railway, but a few changes were implemented. Any carriage that ran on the Necropolis Railway would remain solely with that railway and be completely separate from the mainstream services. The railway bosses were thrilled with the extra profits, were not too keen in mixing carriages that had been used for the dead. If the passengers found out, they may not be as keen to travel. The railway in itself would have its own timetable and its own services. To appease the public and the unimpressed clergy, the carriages were separated, firstly into class and then into Church of England or Nonconformist. The Church of England would be loaded and unloaded on one side, with the Nonconformist loaded and unloaded on the other. To avoid religious clashes, it was decided that the cemetery be divided that way too. 2 stations were built at the cemetery to accommodate. Class also played a part. Each class would offer more home comforts than the one below it, but as you would expect, the fares for the top tiers classes wouldn't be cheap. Not only was the passengers arranged into classes, but the coffins would be too. The railway made sure that those with the right money would receive better care and treatment and a higher degree of decor. Work began on the London terminus in March of 1854. It was built near Waterloo on York Street. It was very quick to complete, and once the ground rules were laid, the stock prepared, the timetables were drawn up, the ground was consecrated, and the new Necropolis Railway was ready to go by November. The service took the pressure off the Magnificent Seven overnight. Scores of dead were taken to Brockwood for burial. And because of its success, the Necropolis Railway was able to expand. It turned its coffin cellars into waiting rooms for the third class, and a new mainline station was built, allowing passengers to visit the cemetery when they wished. At first, 24 coffins could be taken at once, but as the train gained popularity, 2 coffin wagons were expanded to take 48 coffins. Gradually, as time went on, people began to accept them as part of city life. The trains earned the nickname of the Dead Meat Train or the Stiffs Train. And it didn't just take the commoners of London. Several prominent people travelled by the train to their final resting place. One notable person was Charles Bradlaugh. His funeral was so well attended with mourners that the Necropolis had to lay on 3 extra trains just to get the mourners to the graveyard. York Street Station, though, was in itself creating a bit of a problem. People wanting to use the passenger service from Waterloo were being delayed by the Necropolis. The station was so close to Waterloo that Waterloo wasn't even able to expand. The London Necropolis Railway had become its own railway in its own right, and the London and South West Railway was fed up with its partner and wanted the Necropolis to move. The Necropolis, however, had a trick up its sleeve. The York Street Station was given to them on a 999-year lease. They were not moving, and it would take an incredible offer to make them. The London and South West Railway had no choice but to make that offer. They offered to build a bespoke railway station on Westminster Bridge Street. They gave the Necropolis another 1900 and 999-year lease on the building, offered a peppercorn rent on the station, gave them one of its new engines, £12,000 in compensation, and finally validated all of the Necropolis tickets on their own railway, even if that meant it would be an extra cost. Because the Necropolis was not allowed to increase its fares as part of the Act in 1854, some people began to take advantage. Even today, a pathway from Brockwood Station to West Hill Clubhouse, a golfing club for the rich and wealthy, can still be seen. Many assume it was made by golfers using it, dressing up as mourners and wanting to take advantage of the cheap return fares. The new building was state-of-the-art for the time and was very well situated. The station had updated mortuaries, waiting rooms and caretaker apartments, as well as the standard railway amenities. But it also had enough room for a chapel of rest and was able to perform ceremonies there. For the poor, this was a valuable service, but the rich had the option to lie in state, while mourners travelled from around the country for the services. The Necropolis was successful, but it only handled around about 7% of the dead each year, equating to about 3,200 burials. The rest were taken to other cemeteries that opened up in the districts that were much smaller but cheaper and easier to use. It was a very different service to what Londoners were used to. First, the service depending on what you paid. For example, first-class passengers were asked to arrive 10 minutes before the 11:55 departure and were directed to the station's private and elaborately decorated waiting room. The coffins for first class would be sent to the platform first. The mourners would be invited to the platform to watch smartly dressed pallbearers lift the coffin into the first-class private compartment. Once the coffin was aboard, the mourners would be invited into their own private suite aboard the train with the highest of comfort. The service was very different to third class. There, the mourners would be instructed to arrive half an hour before departure and would be mixed with other funeral parties in a communal waiting room. They would not be allowed to be on the platform and see their coffin loaded, nor be allowed to see the other classes. This might seem cruel, but because the cost of funerals was expensive, many poor families had kept the body at home while they saved for the funeral expenses, with no attempts to preserve the body. Normally the first-class bodies were in pretty bad shape and had begun to decay. Once the train was ready, the first class were aboard and the third class were ushered into their seats in the communal carriages, they could set off. The route was specially picked out with rolling hills and stunning countryside before reaching the cemetery. Once arriving at Brookwood, the train would stop at the North Station first. First-class parties, nonconformist funerals would then be removed from the train and their procession would be taken to the chapel before continuing to their own burial site. Once the first class had moved on, the third-class coffins would then be unloaded and a mass service would be given. Unlike many cemeteries within the city, the third-class dead and poor were not given a mass grave but were buried individually. Once the nonconformist funerals were complete, the mourners were left to wander the grounds and take in the beauty of the graveyard while the train pulled into the South Station to repeat the process with Church of England funerals. The necropolis saw a decline in its use going into the 1920s and 30s. It dropped its 7-day-a-week services, and by the time the Second World War came about, it was averaging just about 2 trains a week. The new motor hearses allowed for the railway to be made redundant, and new cemeteries were mostly blamed for the decline. The final nail in the coffin for the necropolis landed on April 16, 1941. Thousands of high explosives rained down on the city. The train, berthed at the station, took a direct hit. The building was destroyed, save for a few rooms, but the damage caused the railway to shut down overnight. After the war, the company debated whether to keep running, but after going over costings and viability, the necropolis decided enough was enough and put the end to the Railway of the Dead. Even though no dedicated railway existed for the dead of London, Brockwood Station would still see the odd funeral from time to time. Instead of dedicated cars, the coffin would travel with the guard in the guard's van. Many other railways practice the same routine. For many high-profile, dignified people, for example Queen Victoria, Winston Churchill and King George, the funeral train was a brilliant tool to allow the general public to pay their last respects. It is very unlikely that a funeral train will ever run again, with British Rail banning the movement of coffins on their network in 1988, and with the increase in air travel, it is easier and quicker to fly the body to the destination and then transport the body by car. It has been 80 years since the Necropolis Railway ran, and virtually all evidence that the railway existed has gone. The main entrance to the station was rebuilt and has recently been turned into private accommodation, and mainline services from Waterloo to Brockwood still run today. Both stations at the cemetery, though, have been demolished, with only their platforms remaining as evidence that there was ever a station at all. The Brockwood Cemetery Society oversee the running and upkeep of the cemetery and often give walking tours along the old trackbed, showing visitors the old railway hardware that still remains. The chapels at Brockwood survive too and are still used for services today, and the graveyard remains the largest in the UK and one of the largest in Europe. It is still used today and has hosted an all manner of people, from army officers to politicians, even royalty and sultans. It is described as London's City of the Dead. The 2,000 acres have been reduced to 500, but it is still an impressive sight. It's no wonder that ghost trains have been around for decades, thanks to the train that takes the dead. The disturbing sight of rotting and foul-smelling corpses looking out from carriage windows as they went along their final journey is enough to terrify anyone, and it's not recommended to stand on the Necropolis station platform at night, especially on Halloween. Surrounded by the dead silence of the night, the odd owl and the creak of the trees in the wind, it is rumoured that the dead train, killed by the bombings, still roams the forgotten railway, desperate to deliver its city's dead.